Hello everyone, this is John from RPGs and More. Let's talk about feudalism in your role-playing games. Feudalism is a form of government that existed primarily in the early to mid-medieval ages, and in some cases we can still see the remnants of it today in some countries still have lords and ladies and knighthoods, as well as kings and queens and dukes and duchesses and all that fun stuff. So, what is feudalism and how do we use it in our role-playing games? Well, in a nutshell, if my memory is correct, feudalism is a form of government where the ruler, most times the king or queen, owns all of the land, all of the castles, everything. They own everything. And then they kind of lease parcels of that land, in some cases very large parcels, to their closest friends and allies, thus creating the dukes and duchesses of the medieval world. Whereupon those dukes and duchesses further subdivide the land into to their followers, leasing it to them. And that's how you get like counts, countesses, marquises, marquesas, and many other terms. And then they further subdivide, those people then further subdivide the land, lending it out to their followers, their servants, and those people then become your barons and baronesses. And then the barons and baronesses will further subdivide again, and they will lease that land out to the knights and other landed servants that will serve them. All right. In all of these situations, you'll notice I use the word lease because the lease lasts as long as the lifetime of the person that the land is granted to. When that person dies, the land in most cases would transfer back to the person that leased it to them, and then that person's family would, apply to, we have a successor and we'd like to have them be reinstated or be instated and whatnot. And then that person would then grant the land to the heir of the person of the former owner of that land. And this lease came with a lot of kind of caveats. One of the main one being taxes was owed. Okay, there's two main ones. Taxes. So the knights would have to pay taxes to the baron. The baron would then pay taxes to the count, and then the count would then pay taxes to the duke, and then the duke would pay taxes to the king. And it would go up. And in some cases, you would get people that did not necessarily owe, they call it fealty or loyalty to the person directly above them in this case. For example, you could have a count who was not created by a duke and was instead created by the king themselves. In that case, the count then owes fealty directly to the king. Because along with these grants of land comes oaths of fealty. You don't get the land without the fealty. And what fealty means is that you pledge everything that you are or might become to that person above you. It is a sacred vow, or at least it's supposed to be. And that means that you will show up and do whatever it is they ask you to do, serving them to the best of your ability for the rest of your life, unless they tell you your oath is fulfilled, you may go. In which case you probably will lose the lands, but that's another story. So that's why the land would be granted, and these people, they would pay the taxes. This other thing that they would do is they would provide military service. So if the king said, I need an army because, so-and-so is invading, or so-and-so, we want to conquer them, they would call up their vassals, the people who directly owed them fealty. In this case, and using our example, they'd call out to the dukes and duchesses and say, build me an army worthy of my kingdom. And those people would then call up those who owed fealty to them and say, the time has come, let's build an army, call up your people. And then they would continue going down until it trickled all the way down to the knights, in which case the knights themselves would begin to gather up all the men-at-arms that they employed and answer the call of their local baron, who then would also bring up the men-at-arms that he or she, baroness, kind of also employed, and then that whole shebang, or at least the parts of it that the baron or baroness felt comfortable not allowing to leave their own castles, which would be most of the people would go. A token force would stay behind. And they'd all go to the, wherever the army is supposed to be gathering. In some cases, they might gather with the count, and then the count would then meet the other counts and countesses at the duke's place, and then everyone would go from the duke's place to where the king was going to meet. Or the king would just designate a place and everyone would just gather there, and then they'd all find each other once they got there and figure out where they were supposed to be, based upon banners, and that plays into heraldry, and heraldry is a whole nother kettle of fish. But this is the basic idea, is that all these things could be called up, and the king could call upon this every year. Every year the king had the right to call upon this fealty and raise armies for a task or for something in particular. And these armies would be raised at the expense, primarily, of the people who raised them. The king did not pay those soldiers. The king would pay soldiers that they personally hired, but they would not pay the soldiers that were brought to them by the counts or the dukes or the barons. That's what my memory tells me. That evolved as time went on and systems changed, but in the purest form of feudalism, the idea is that those were not paid by the king. Excuse me. Now, how did this evolve? Well, it really started evolving pretty quickly. One of the things that nobles didn't like is, I've been serving, my family's been serving this king for 3 generations, and now the king's got a wild hair up their butt, and my family has been stripped of their rights and their lands because they dared to speak out against the king. And I have nothing I can do about it because the king owns everything. Well, a lot of nobles didn't like that. And so they rose up against it. And they challenged the king at the time. I believe this was this is the beginning of Magna Carta. And that was one of the rights that nobles wanted, is the lands that were granted to them belonged to them and could not be stripped away without cause by the king or ruler. It's a lot more complex than that. There's a lot more to it, but if you want to know about that, please research Magna Carta. This is not that video. We're just talking about feudalism in general. I do recommend researching Magna Carta just for fun because it's really cool, and you can actually get a fair amount of starter information by watching the new Robin Hood movie with Russell Crowe. Good movie. Anyway, so that changed the dynamic. Once the nobles started being able to have it declared that their lands were owned by them and their heirs in perpetuity, then suddenly their loyalty to the king or the ruler wasn't as important. because the ruler was not the guarantor of the continuation of their family's wealth and good fortune. And that's when we get into scenarios where they started warring on each other in order to increase their lands, and rulers were powerless to stop it because they had no authority to go in and say, no, I revoke your ownership of this land because you're not following my orders. You're not keeping the peace. Because no ruler wants vassals who are going to be constantly fighting each other and killing each other. Because yes, the strongest ones will get to the top, maybe, or the most clever, maybe, you might hope so, but what you're also going to get is a lot of people dead. And when you are in a feudal society that relies upon calling up all those people in order to defend the land if someone wants to invade, like say a foreign power who decides, wow, those lands look tasty, you don't want to have half your people already dead because your forces kept fighting each other for supremacy and you had no ability to stop them. Rulers didn't like that. There's a lot of different balances here. It's a highly complex thing, but that's where a lot of things started to change. Now, what feudalism can do for your role-playing games depends on what kind of era you want to set it in. If you want to go back to the early Dark Ages idea of feudalism, which is kind of what I described, the ideal version of what I described, then what that does is that sets up a structured society where your adventurers can gain reputation as warriors or spellcasters or people of note. And they can use that reputation in order to impress their social betters, the local baron perhaps. And then that local baron, once they're successfully impressed, will be willing to grant that character or that group of characters a plot of land where they can build a manor house and start to, or take over a manor house that is currently not being utilized and take custody or take the lease on land that's probably already populated with some common folk who they are then responsible for. And that's kind of the thing, like those common folk, they would come and they would kind of give their fealty to the adventurers, but then that also means the adventurers become responsible for those common folk, which means if the adventurers don't take care of that plot of land, if they make the common folk unhappy, then their lord, the common folk, can complain to their lord. And their lord has the ability to come and take it away from them. Which, yeah, that could lead to some moments of party conflict and story development, because it means once you get that plot of land, you're not guaranteed to keep it unless you take care of it. Which means you have to actively engage with the people in your settlement. You have to really, and when I say take care of them, yes, that means defend them when they're being threatened by monsters or by plague or by natural disasters. You have to be able to give them refuge from the ravages of life. You have to be able to provide succor against the craziness that can be brought in, especially in a magical society. And if they can't do that because they're always out on an adventure, then they may lose the land unless they find capable people, capable seneschals to take care of their land while they're not there. They are going to probably eventually lose the land. So it's a different mindset. You have to have the mindset of, I want to go out adventuring, maybe once or twice a season. I'm going to go and I'm going to, go and spend like a week in that dungeon and then come back. And then I've got to get back to the grind. We've got to take care of these people. We've got to oversee, the law in this area. We have to make sure that we are guaranteeing the safety and security of the people around us. We have to enter into negotiations with our neighbors to make sure that prices are being set fairly, that trade between my fief and my neighbor's fief is occurring without our people getting cheated, and without our people cheating their people, because that's a whole different kettle of fish too. And that's kind of, that politics creates a lot of good fodder for socially based games, but also for games that deal with a lot of smaller adventures. So instead of having a big grandiose quest of we're going to save the world and kill all the dragons, or, the beholder and whatnot, what you're looking at is something that could be more akin to what people think of when they see the Adventurers Guild motif with all the quests on the wall, and go and pick one off the wall and then run that quest for maybe 1 or 2 game sessions and then come back and get the next one. Well, what you're going to have is you're going to have a lot of smaller things that need to get done in order to take care of your people. It's kind of like, what's going on? Timmy got stuck in the well. Well, let's go get Timmy out of the well. What's going on? Timmy's lost in the caves. Let's go get Timmy. Okay. Oh my gosh, the fields are cursed by the witch, so bring the witch in. Let's talk to the witch. Let's go, let's try to figure this out. Or what? The witch refused to come. Well, I guess we're going to her because I can't let people refuse to come and then get away with it. So let's go, and you have all these different concepts that can be drawn in your small little fief, because even the smallest fief, that it's a manor house and a village and farms, you're still going to be looking at probably a couple dozen families and up to 100 people, maybe even more than that. And that's a lot of personalities. That's a lot of options for interpersonal interactions, but it's also a lot of opportunities for small-time quests. And there can be wandering monsters that come into that area. A group of goblins sets up camp nearby. Do you welcome them and try to turn them into vassals that will serve you and give them a piece of the community? Or are you afraid of them and do you try to drive them off because goblins have this terrible reputation in your campaign world? Or maybe they have a great reputation in your campaign world as creatures that are very crafty. And so you kind of court the goblins. And instead of demanding they swear loyalty to you, you simply demand you simply want them to come and work, and you entice them with some sort of offer of, no taxes for the next 3 months or whatever it is. All right. And when you run it that way, then you can also have them rise up in ranks, because you can get to that scenario where a baron is mistreating their people, is just doing the wrong things altogether, and the player characters lead a rebellion against the baron. Well, now they can do that directly by rebelling against the baron, taking up arms and fighting and doing all that. That's one way to do it. But another way to do it would be to send envoys, aka the player characters, who have gained reputation, who have become these famous adventurers, who are probably known beyond the borders of the baron's lands. And you go to the count, the person who owes fealty to the baron, and you present your case. And maybe you do service for that count, something to prove yourself, something the count needs. But then that causes the count to raise up, they call up the rest of their army, and they go down and they relieve the baron or the baroness of their lands. And that's how the players, who at this point were previously knights or local mages, suddenly find themselves, now one of them is a baron or a baroness. And they've just climbed the social ladder. And you can keep on doing that. Another way you can use feudalism in your campaign, if you want to do the kind of campaign where it's a lot of wilderness and the player characters are going out there to take the wilderness away from the monsters and settle it for the good folks, if you want to use that term. Now, some people may not like this because it definitely has smacks of the colonization of other countries by Europeans, and I'm not going to say that they're wrong. It does definitely seem like that, especially when you start saying, well, actually, you've got these highly developed societies of hobgoblins and goblins and orcs, and we're just going to kill them all because we want their land. All right, well, that's a bit, yeah, you can do that. If that's your jam, like, don't let me tell you not to do stuff, okay? If that's your jam, then and your players are fine with it, then go for it. It's fine. I'm trying to get away from that stuff a little bit myself, but at the same time, there are days when you just want to go and kill a bunch of goblins, and because you just you're tired of you're tired of complicated things and you want a simple quest. And for those, I'm kind of leaning towards things like slimes at this point, because at least you can make jokes about it's a slime. I mean, who's going to care? That's the way that we used to talk about goblins. But I've grown a bit more attached to goblins in most cases, unless they're the kind of goblins that occur in some other media that you may see figures from in the background of my thing. In which case, they all need to die. But that's not your typical fantasy goblin. So, all right, let's talk about. We talked about the feudalism. We talked about how the basic form of feudalism and how it can work. Well, if we look at the more advanced form of feudalism, the kind where it's gotten muddied a little bit, and you've got barons that no longer are required to swear fealty to the king, to the current king, in order to maintain their lands and property, and then maintain that oath for fear of losing those lands and property. Now more shenanigans gets to happen. That's when the real political intrigue starts becoming intriguing in many ways, because they really don't have to listen to the king or the queen or anyone above them, really. They only have to listen to themselves. They get to become selfish. They get to do whatever they want, and no one really gets to tell them that they can't, unless it's someone with an army equal to size or bigger than theirs. But at the same time, there's this veneer of civilization. There's this veneer of it, this idea that we are better than the people beneath us in the social world. So we can't be seen to be so aggressive. And so they're going to go subtle. You can have a lot of fun with those subtle things. You can have game sessions where the war is decided in the boardroom, not on the battlefield. And therefore, the social skills of your player characters become more important, because they're the ones who are either setting up the alliances, they're going to allow that battle to be won, or they're breaking up the alliances of the enemy through subtle and not so subtle diplomacy or espionage. So that's a fun thing that you can do with that later version of feudalism. So let's talk about like the class structure within feudalism and how people could move up and down. In the early days of feudalism, all you needed to move up was money and recognition. You could become a knight or a ritter simply by being good at fighting and having enough money to get yourself a horse, a suit of armor, and a good spear. And that was not a small amount of money. That's a significant amount of money. But it was open to pretty much anyone who their family had built up some generational wealth by, we've got our farm, and then we've bought, the second farm over when that family decided they couldn't run it anymore, so we bought it from them or took it over from them, and And now we've got more money coming in. We can hire people to work the farm for us while we kind of do other things. And now my son gets to train with weapons, and then later my son gets to go off and I get to send him off to become a knight. This is a generational plan of wealth creation, which would then allow these knights to be formed. So, how did it change? Excuse me. Well, it changed because the people in power, the people who had spent those generations building up their power, decided that they didn't really want too many other new people like them to come up, because the new people tended to be more ambitious. They tended to be more ruthless in some cases, or the ones who have the ability to rise through the ranks and have that recognized, and the audacity to tell the current people, thumb their nose at the current rulers. They don't want those people. They want those people to be kept down, because that threatens their own position. That means that those people might actually take their feudal spot from them. And so that's when a lot of the rules started being put in place, specifically the rules about bloodline. You had to come from a recognized noble family in order to be declared a knight. You had to be part of the club, with the idea being that people in the club were going to be better, and that people in the club were going to be more capable of taking care of their responsibilities. And now, people in the club being better? Not really, no. They were people that tended to grow up with the same kind of society, so the same kind of views, and they tended to understand each other better, but they were not better people. In many cases, they were worse people, especially after several generations of not having to understand how the common folk really lived. But what they were is part of the club. And that started the whole nobility thing that ends up with the Edwardian society stuff, or the Victorian society stuff that brings us such joy in some of our period dramas. But it all started way back in the Dark Ages with a lot of that. If you want to think about another an idea of a knight-like person that was not necessarily a knight in the Norman sense, you can look up Husquarels. They were used in the Saxons as well, and in some cases they were represented by the Vikings too, I think, if I remember correctly, the Husquarels. And the Husquarels were kind of like knights, but they fought on foot. They didn't fight on horseback, and they were responsible for providing their own gear, but they were definitely powerful warriors that would get a farm of their own. And there's versions of them that existed all over Europe, all over Britain and Ireland. You would find this concept. So you're not limited to just knights. If you want a feudal society, you can do other things too. So don't feel like you're in a box. We can leave the box behind and do some other stuff. So the noble family had to be established. And how did you know that you were a noble family? Well, you either came from an already established noble family, or you had to be recognized. And typically you would have to be recognized by someone in high enough status to be able to establish you as a noble. And since most of those people really didn't want to do that, or the lands were all spoken for, so it was hard to find new lands. And kings later on were much more reluctant to make new nobles, because every time they did that, then that's less land that the king had that would pay taxes directly to the king, and that's less money that the king or queen would have to be able to do the things that they wanted to do, including raising their own armies without relying upon the nobles that now were more likely to thumb their noses at them. And they were probably going to have to raise up the army against the nobles when the nobles wanted to rebel. So they needed to have lands and money themselves. And so the king started getting creative on how to get the lands returned back to them after these nobles, made it, like, oh, we now own the land. Like, no, gosh, no, what am I going to do? Is what the king would say. So there's a lot of stuff that can play into this kind of. Oh yeah, so you had to get recognized and be created as a noble, or to become even a lesser noble. You had to get recognized by some sort of great deed, which is, easy for us to do in our role-playing games. That's what our adventurers do. They perform great deeds one way or another. Or they collect enough money that they can pay for it, because money still talks, even in the Middle Ages. But in a lot of cases, even the people who buy into the nobility, they're going to have a hard time being recognized and accepted. And that's going to cause strife. But where strife exists is also opportunity for adventure. And I want you to think about that and think about what kind of adventures could you do with someone who is being raised up towards, wealth and nobility, but didn't start out that way and hasn't necessarily been educated on A, how to survive in the society, and B, all the things that nobles typically are educated for. Because nobles would learn mathematics, nobles would learn geometry, engineering, anything that struck their fancy, really, astronomy. They would learn all of these things to be able to do stuff that most people couldn't do. And so you get someone who's raised up from the ground, very rarely would they know how to read and write. This is actually shown very well in a series of movies called Sharp's Rifles, starring Sean Bean. And in this series, it follows a British officer named Sharp, Richard Sharp, who starts off, he's been a sergeant in the Navy, in the Army. Navy is a different one, that's Horatio Hornblower. He starts off as a sergeant in the Army, and he saves the future Wellington's life, and is thus turned into a lieutenant, or lieutenant, for those of you who are on my side of the pond. And he finds himself in this position where he is a common soldier, raised up on the streets of, I believe it was Yorkshire. And he has to learn how to command the people that don't respect him because he's one of them. And then he has to also deal with officers who don't respect him because he is not one of them. And there's a lot of interesting interpersonal dynamics that are covered throughout that series, but especially in the first 3 films in that series. So if you're curious about that sort of thing, highly recommended to watch those. So this is a little more than a brief touch on feudalism, but there's some ideas here. I hope that some of this is useful. Thank you for sticking around this long. If you would like to hear more of my thoughts on this topic, let me know. If you've got anything particularly that you want me to cover that you think you could use a little more, elbow grease or a little more words, put it in the comments down below. Please like the video, subscribe if you like to see more of this. I will start the next solo campaign relatively soon. I'm waiting for a couple things to be delivered in the mail. I'm going to, in a future video, I'm going to take some time to turn all the monsters. I'm going to take all the monsters from the Swords and Wizardry Continual Light Monster Manual, and I'm going to put them on note cards, not note cards, on playing cards, blank playing cards that I ordered, and then connect them up with the miniatures of monsters that I have. and kind of see and maybe create some new ones as well, so that I can use those to create random encounter decks for the solo game, just to give it a little more spice, a little more fun, and so I'm not able to predict a lot of what's going to happen next. So that's a future video coming up before I jump into the series itself. Yeah, thank you again for stopping by. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and peace be with you. Bye-bye.